Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The African American Soldier, a 200-year history of African Americans in the U.S. military, by Lieutenant Colonel, retired, Michael Lee Lanning. Narrated by Terrence Kidd. 1. Colonial Days and the Revolutionary War. The year was 1770. Although it was 6 years before the American Revolutionary War, Boston colonists were already chafing under the presence of the garrison of British soldiers stationed by the Crown in their port city. The lingering winter weather and the arrogance of the redcoat soldiers made tempers short and the desire for change strong. Warming himself near a fire and listening to the litany of complaints from his companions on the early evening of March 5th, Crispus Attucks, too, was ready for action. As a runaway slave who had eluded capture for 20 years, Attucks knew firsthand about the unfair treatment of which the colonists spoke and the acts of rebellion about which they dreamed. At 47, he was a veteran of both, a man who had escaped bondage to find his freedom on the hazardous and arduous high seas. Awaiting a break in the weather before his ship could sail, Attucks understood the risks of defiance better than most of those who were, in the comfort of the fire's warming radiance, recounting the British injustices against the Americans. Suddenly the group became aware of excited voices and the ringing of the town's alarm bell. Attucks was the first out the door to investigate the commotion. In the snow-covered streets he saw colonists clustered near the British garrison. In loud voices, and with animated movements, the men seemed to be arguing among themselves, some pointing at the British, others trying to pull them away. As Attucks moved toward the center of the disturbance on King Street, some of the American colonists began to flee. Attucks stopped the first man he met. In an agitated voice, the colonist told Attucks that a British soldier had refused to pay a barber after receiving a haircut. The young man had pursued the soldier into the street, demanding his money. The soldier laughed and knocked the youth to the ground. Outraged witnesses came to the support of the barber, only to have more soldiers arrive and threaten to kill them all. Incensed at the audacity of the threat, the colonists had begun verbally attacking the soldiers as they marched back to their barracks. The jeering crowd had grown, but was undecided as to what to do. As Attucks watched, the colonists began reluctantly to retreat. Angered by the story and the attitude of the British, the short, stocky Attucks advanced toward the garrison, determinedly pushing his way through the hesitant crowd and urging them to stand against the soldiers. With the leader at their helm, the colonists turned once more and followed Attucks to the custom-house. The crowd swelled and began hurling snowballs and rocks at the sentinels, who, terrified by the crowd's mood, called for reinforcements. With the colonist behind him, Attucks led the confrontation, throwing snowballs and anything else he could find on the street at the concentrated redcoats. At one point, he picked up a stick, which he menacingly wielded like a club as he dared the British soldiers to fire. Spurred on by the bravery of the curly-haired African-American, the colonists unleashed even more obscenities and missiles against the soldiers. The disciplined custom-house guards endured the chaos, knowing they could shoot only on orders from their officers or from the civil magistrate. Even the arrival of their captain, Thomas Preston, who tried in vain to disperse the crowd, did not quell the flurry of thrown objects and verbal abuse. Lack of action by the British served only to inflame the Bostonians further. With at least a dozen men behind him, Attucks confronted the soldiers by striking their muskets with his stick. When the British captain stepped forward, Attucks swung his club at the officer's head. In warding off the blow, Preston bumped into one of his soldiers, causing him to drop his weapon. Instantly, Attucks seized the musket. The soldier also grabbed for the gun, and the two struggled for control. In wresting the weapon from Attucks, the soldier stumbled and fell. While he was down, The colonists, now confident that the British would do nothing, turned their chants to, "Why don't you fire? Why don't you fire?" Attucks, leaning on his stick, mockingly stared at the fallen redcoat. Humiliated, the British soldier regained his feet and fired directly into Attucks. Instantly, the other soldiers also opened fire. When Attucks fell dead from 2 bullets in his chest, he became the first American to die in the course of events which would lead to independence for the United States. The colonists declared Crispus Attucks a hero, for he took action against the British when others were willing only to talk. He stood against subjugation when others were willing to submit. He sacrificed his life for freedom when others were willing to live under hellish conditions. The irony of his heroism was that as a black man, Crispus Attucks would have not enjoyed the benefits of American independence had he lived. Although he knew this, he was willing to give his life for the good of the country. In doing so, he joined a long line of other African Americans who would also sacrifice themselves for freedoms and benefits they, as individuals, could not enjoy. African Americans have always played a significant role in the military history of the United States. Their participation in and contributions to pivotal events parallel those of other Americans even before the Revolutionary War. For almost 5 centuries, Black Americans have been an integral part of the development of the Americas, fighting and sometimes dying in pursuit of a better life. In the case of the United States, African Americans have participated in every American conflict, often forced to struggle for the right to fight for their country. Ironically, like Crispus Attucks, many Black Americans have sacrificed themselves for the American cause in war, while equality remained beyond their reach in peace, withheld by prejudice and ignorance. The contributions made by African Americans in the New World began with the first European explorations. At least one man of African heritage, Pedro Alonso Niño, sailed with Christopher Columbus on his 1492 voyage of discovery. Another black sailor, Diego El Negro, accompanied Columbus on his last voyage to the New World in July 1502. In subsequent Spanish explorations, Africans served the military expeditions as servants, laborers, and soldiers. When Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed Central America to reach the Pacific Ocean, at least 30 black men occupied his ranks. Africans also accompanied Hernán Cortés in his conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico in 1519 and assisted Francisco Pizarro in conquering the Incas in Peru in 1533. Enslaved Africans arrived in great numbers in the Western Hemisphere as the Spanish settled the Caribbean islands, their first foothold in colonizing the Americas. It is not surprising that black people were an integral part of the subsequent Spanish conquests. The first Africans to arrive in North America did so as part of a brief effort by Spain to establish a colony near the mouth of the Pedee River in present-day South Carolina. Details are sketchy, but records indicate that 100 slaves accompanied 500 Spaniards to establish a settlement in 1526. In a matter of only a few months, the effort failed, and the survivors returned to Spanish island communities in the Caribbean. Some accounts attribute the failure of the colony to an uprising by the slaves, but no factual information remains to substantiate this claim. The most significant black man in the early explorations of North America arrived via shipwreck on the southeast coast of what is now Texas in 1528. Among the survivors were the expedition's leader, Cabeza de Vaca, the Spanish soldier Dorantes, and his black slave Esteban, who quickly became twice a slave when local Indians captured all the castaways. Eventually, Esteban, de Vaca, Dorantes, and several others escaped overland to Mexico City, arriving there after a journey of 8 years. Esteban remained a slave, but his skills in Indian Sign Language, learned while a captive, led to his earning another first in the New World. In 1536, Esteban, acting as a scout and interpreter for expeditions into the American Southwest, became the first non-Indian to visit what would become New Mexico and Arizona. 3 years later, Esteban returned to the Southwest as a guide for Spaniards seeking the fabled 7 golden cities of Cibola. Esteban found no gold, but did reach the Zuni village of Hawicou in New Mexico, where the Indians, angered at the intrusion, executed him. Unlike the Spanish, who had developed a slave system in the Caribbean, English settlers establishing colonies along the East Coast brought no Africans, slave or free, with them. Not until a little more than a decade after the first English settlement in America at Jamestown did the first Africans arrive among the English. Slaves joined the colony on August 20th, 1619, when a Dutch ship anchored at the Virginia colony and offered 20 individuals, recently captured in Africa, in exchange for provisions. Initially, the small population of slaves represented no threat to the white majority. In fact, the number of Africans in the North American colonies increased so slowly that it was not until 1638 that the first slaves appeared on the auction block in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The enslaved black population provided what the whites perceived as reinforcements from the real threat to the colonies, the Native American Indians. During this time, the colonial militias welcomed both free and slave Africans into their ranks to repel Native American attacks and to join the occasional offensive operations against Indian villages. As the slave population increased, however, the subjugated black people, many of whom were now trained in arms and military procedures, themselves became a threat to the whites. In 1639, the General Assembly of Virginia passed the first act in American history, excluding black men from military service, declaring all persons, except Negroes, to be provided with arms and ammunition, or be fined at pleasure of the governor and council. In 1656, Massachusetts followed Virginia's lead and excluded black men from service in the colonial militia. Connecticut did likewise after joining an uprising of the Indian and black populations near Hartford in 1661. By the end of the 17th century, all of the colonies had officially excluded black men from serving in the military. Some of them did amend the restrictions and allowed free black people and a few slaves to serve as drummers, fifers, cooks, and laborers, as well as in other unarmed positions. In terms of self-protection, the whites' precautions were not without foundation, for the enslaved understandably did not accept their bondage peacefully or willingly. In 1663, the first recorded slave uprising in the English colonies occurred in Gloucester County, Virginia. For the next 100 years, more than 250 slave revolts occurred throughout the colonies. The whites routinely put down the rebellions by ruthlessly torturing and killing the instigators. Except for a few African communities whose citizens, known as Maroons, maintained their freedom in remote mountain or swamp villages, no attempts at gaining freedom were successful. Despite their potential threat to the whites, black men did fight in the militias during the various conflicts with the Indians, and later against the French, in the first half of the 18th century, when white colonists either rescinded or ignored the various laws restricting African Americans from active military service. As would be the model for centuries to come, black men served in armed positions when white Americans felt threatened by outside enemies, fighting and dying for a culture that did not recognize them as equals. Few of the accomplishments of black Americans of the time found their way into recorded history, but what records do exist show that black men served loyally and well. Black soldiers fought and died in the colonial militia in King William's War, 1689, Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, and in numerous campaigns against the Indians of various magnitude. In some cases, slaves who distinguished themselves in battle became freemen. During fights against Indians in 1703, South Carolina offered emancipation to any slave who killed or captured one or more of the hostiles. The state, at the charge of the public, compensated the slaves' owners. In most instances, however, at the conclusion of the crisis, black soldiers found themselves once more disarmed and returned to their masters. During the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, black men joined the colonial militias in support of the British against the French and their Indian allies. Once again, most of these black men served in support positions as laborers and wagoners. Only a few acted as scouts and regular soldiers. The slaves received equal pay to that of their white fellow soldiers, but had to surrender all or part of the wages to their owners. As in the past, some black men gained their freedom for honorable service, but the majority of the slave soldiers returned to bondage at the end of the hostilities. The only place where any degree of real racial equality existed in pre-Revolutionary War America was at sea. Again, circumstances rather than any compassion among the white majority were responsible. Conditions aboard merchant and fishing vessels as well as on military privateers were so intolerable that many white sailors deserted. Free black people and runaway slaves welcomed the opportunity for employment, regardless of the conditions, and shared mostly equal pay as part of integrated crews. By 1775, the total population of the English colonies in America was about 3 million, 600,000 of whom were Africans or of African descent. In the southern colonies, where agricultural field crops benefited the most from indentured labor, slaves constituted almost 40% of the population. With so many held in bondage, the potential of a slave rebellion kept the white population so fearful that few African Americans received any military training. Except for the threat of a slave uprising and the occasional use of black Americans in the militia when the situation warranted, white Americans appeared to pay little attention to the overall question of slavery, other than its favorable impact on the economic development of the colonies and the enrichment of the colonists. Not until they themselves began to feel oppressed by increased control and taxation by Great Britain did some Americans begin to question their own position as oppressors and the morality of owning fellow human beings. Despite their harsh treatment and continued enslavement, many African Americans closed ranks, as did Crispus Attucks, with the white colonist as the Revolutionary War neared. When the smoke cleared on Boston's King Street that March day in 1770, Attucks and 4 white patriots lay dead. The Boston Massacre became a rallying point for those opposing British rule, and an anniversary marked by ceremony both during and after the Revolutionary War. In 1889, the city dedicated the Crispus Attucks Monument on Boston Common. Despite the death of Attucks and the service of slaves in the militias, the efforts and stated purpose to free the colonies from Great Britain provided neither freedom nor equality for African Americans. Initial drafts of the Declaration of Independence in 1775 contained language damning slavery and extending freedom to all. However, because of objections from the Southern delegations, the final version, which stated that all men are created equal and guaranteed certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to all, did not apply to enslaved or free Americans. Although they faced exclusion from the objectives of the American Revolution, black Americans participated in the war from its very beginnings. Several black militiamen were among those firing the shots heard round the world at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. One of the first Americans to fall at Lexington Green was Prince Estabrook, a black soldier in Captain John Parker's company of Minutemen. With the Revolutionary War now officially begun, the Committee of Safety, also known as the Hancock and Warren Committee, which orchestrated the early efforts of the rebellion, met in May 1775 to determine the role of African Americans in the rebel military. The committee determined that while free black men could serve, slaves could not, because their service would be inconsistent with the principles that are to be supported and reflect dishonor on this colony. Black men already in uniform remained on duty, however. While their numbers, both slave and freemen, were small, their bravery and impact were enormous. For example, some reports from the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, credit Peter Salem, a former slave freed shortly before the battle, with killing the British assault force commander, Major John Pitcairn, with a musket shot. While Salem's accomplishments at Bunker Hill lack official substantiation, the brave service of fellow black soldier Salem Poor is well documented. Following the battle, Poor received praise from his white commanders when they reported that he behaved like an experienced officer as well as an excellent soldier. He also received an official commendation for his performance in a report to the Massachusetts Bay General Court, dated December 5, 1775. We would only beg leave to say, in the person of this said Negro, centers a brave and gallant soldier. Despite the number of black militiamen in the Revolution's early battles, African Americans had not yet officially gained the right to join the fight for American independence. On June 17, 1775, while the Battle of Bunker Hill raged in Boston, the Continental Congress assumed jurisdiction of the various colonial militias and formed the Continental Army, with General George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington, a Virginia slave owner who disliked the idea of black slaves or freemen serving with whites, excluded them from his ranks. On July 9, 1775, Washington's adjutant general issued orders to recruiters not to enlist any deserter from the ministerial British Army, nor any stroller, Negro, or vagabond in the Continental Army. During the next 3 months, the numbers of the Continental Army dwindled due to casualties, desertions, and completed enlistments. As a result, Washington and his staff met to reconsider the enrollment of black men. Prejudices, however, continued to prevail over practicality. By a unanimous decision on October 8th, Washington and his staff agreed to continue to exclude slaves from enlistment. By a large majority, they also concurred with the decision not to permit the enlistment of free black men. A few weeks later, the Continental Congress backed Washington and his staff and stated that black Americans, free or enslaved, should be rejected altogether from the Army. On November 12, 1775, Washington issued an official order preventing the enlistment of black men and allowing those currently in uniform to remain only until their current enlistments expired. State and local militias across the newly declared United States of America followed suit. The whites' reasons for denying black Americans the right to fight for their country's freedom ranged from personal prejudice to economic considerations. Many American whites, particularly those in the South, considered black people subhuman, inferior, and cowardly, and refused to serve with them as equals. Although black soldiers fought bravely in all the early battles of the Revolution, white soldiers responded angrily to the taunts of the regular British soldiers, who shouted jingles about their African-American comrades. The rebel clowns, oh, what a sight! Too awkward was the figure, 'twas yonder stood a pious white, and here and there a nigger. White slave owners had no intention of giving up what they considered their private property for the war. They preferred to keep their chattel in the fields, earning them a profit, rather than risk their lives on the battlefield. Not all Americans agreed with the policies of prohibiting black men from the military. Freemen argued for the right to serve, and many slaves expressed their desire for the privilege to fight. Some officers within the Army shared these sentiments. In an October 24, 1775 letter to John Adams, General John Thomas wrote that he supported such enlistments because black Americans have proved themselves brave. Whereas black men faced exclusion from the white American militias, they found themselves welcomed into the British ranks for 2 reasons. Firstly, the British were happy to recruit African Americans to augment their personnel shortages that resulted from worldwide commitments of the Empire. Secondly, the British sensed how divisive slavery was among the white Americans and wished to exploit the weakness. On November 7, 1775, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore and the Royal Governor of colonial Virginia, issued a proclamation. I do hereby declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to the rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to proper dignity. Within a month, 300 escaped slaves joined Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, donning uniforms inscribed with the slogan, "Liberty to Slaves." Over the next few months, more than 30,000 slaves crossed the lines, seeking the freedom denied them by their American masters. Other British units accepted runaway slaves in their camps as laborers, wagon masters, and horse handlers. Some became paid servants to officers, while others took more unusual jobs. The hangman at the 1776 execution of rebel spy Nathan Hale in New York was Bill Richmond, a man of color. Pressured by the loss of slaves to Lord Dunmore, a shortage of enlistees, and continuous protest by the free black community, Washington reconsidered his exclusion policy. On December 30th, 1775, the American general issued orders that authorized the enlistment of free black men, but continued the ban on recruiting slaves. He reinforced his denial of slave enlistments in a general order on February 21st, 1776. Despite official policy, slaves did join the ranks of the Continental Army. Sometimes they were able to enlist because subordinate unit commanders, always short of personnel, refused to quibble over the free or slave status of black men and integrated the volunteers directly into the ranks. In other instances, slaves joined as substitutes for their masters, who chose not to personally fight for independence. The situation changed when the British defeated Washington at New York in the fall of 1776, and the Continental Army had to confront the fact that, with its numbers and morale in jeopardy, the success of the revolution was in doubt. The turning point for black enlistments came in September, when the Continental Congress asked that states raise 88 battalions to reinforce the Army. A request followed 3 months later by an order for an additional 16 battalions, with instructions that the ranks be filled by drafts from their militia or in any other way. Black enlistments increased dramatically when some states, especially those in the northern and mid-Atlantic regions, liberally interpreted in any other way as authorization to recruit African Americans. These states enticed both freemen and slaves to enlist, offering slaves freedom at war's end. An additional incentive for securing slave enlistments was the guarantee to owners that the states would compensate them at market value for all freed slaves. Only in the Deep South did black men face continued resistance to their enlistment. By mid-1776, black Americans served in nearly every battalion in the Continental Army as either infantrymen in regiments, recruited in the North, or as servants and support personnel in Southern regiments. Reports by British officers noted that most of the units they faced had several black faces interspersed in their ranks. Whether volunteer or substitute, black soldiers acquitted themselves well. A Hessian mercenary officer in service of the British recorded in his personal journal on October 23, 1777, "The Negro could take the field instead of his master, and therefore no regiment is to be seen in which there are not Negroes in abundance, and among them are able-bodied, strong, and brave fellows." Washington, now more concerned with the possibility of losing the war than with his objections to African Americans, also accepted their service. Several black soldiers, including Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, accompanied Washington's night crossing of the Delaware on Christmas, 1776, to surprise and defeat the British Hessian garrison at Trenton. Although not confirmed by recorded history, several of the later paintings of Washington crossing the icy river depict one or more black men aboard his boat. Throughout the Continental Army, officers recognized the need for black enlistees to bolster their ranks. Alexander Hamilton, a member of Washington's staff, wrote the President of the Continental Congress, John Jay, on March 12, 1779, declaring, "I have not the least doubt that the Negroes will make very excellent soldiers." Hamilton then continued with a thoughtful summary of the entire question of African-American enlistees, writing, "The contempt we have been taught to entertain for the blacks makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason nor experience. and an unwillingness to part with property of so valuable a kind will furnish 1,000 arguments to show the impracticability.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?